a significant portion of the memories that we create and the interactions that we have. Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm an archaeologist and an architectural historian, and I've been playing Final Fantasy XIV for about a year and a half now. And the greater Final Fantasy franchise for a little bit over 20 years, as weird as that is to say. And it's unmistakable that the landscape of every single game within the Final Fantasy franchise is just immaculately designed. But when I started playing 14 and started to look at the very small details of the game, it became hard not to look at the game through the lens of a cultural resource professional. Now, if you've been able to tune into Archeo Gaming Con so far, then you're probably already familiar with the term cultural resource. But if not, it really boils down to what tangibly remains from past human activity, whether that's earthworks from like the Civil War or from Native American mound building, archaeological sites, petroglyphs and cave paintings, ruins, cultural landscapes, artifacts, monuments, and buildings. Basically, anything that's been created or modified by human is what we consider to be a cultural resource. There's been a significant amount of interest recently, not only in digital preservation of the physical built environment, but in the preservation of video games and digital media. Typically, when a preservationist mentions digital preservation, we're usually referring to the digitization of records about the built environment, maybe some 3D modeling or photogrammetry of historic buildings, rather than the preservation of the digital landscape. However, several archivists, curators, and academics have become really increasingly interested in the preservation of video games, as it's widely accepted now that they're just as culturally significant as film, literature, music, and are very much works of art and engineering. Naturally, there's going to be copyright laws in place that make that pursuit of preservation quite the challenge. However, if creating a system of planning for preservation like we have for the physical environment was possible, we actually might be able to overcome some of those challenges in tandem with developers and designers. A report a few years ago, I think around 2018, by the Association of Research Libraries suggested that archivists are already kind of frustrated and concerned by copyright policies surrounding software. And they specifically state that it's imperiling the future of digital memory, which is a concern, right? Because we're now in a time where a significant portion of the memories that we create and the interactions that we have are occurring in digital space. One option to start thinking about developing a parallel for the video game industry like we have for the physical built environment, and one of my very favorite things to teach people about and to talk about is the National Register of Historic Places, and I'll kind of expand on that a little bit in just a minute. So you might already be familiar with the National Register too, without knowing it. If you've ever visited a historic town and you've seen the plaques affixed to the side of buildings, telling you kind of when they're from, who built them, and what year they were constructed, or perhaps there's a historic marker that you've seen in front of a site of commemoration, and whether we realize it or not, the National Register of Historic Places, at least in the United States, and these commemorative plaques, and on a global scale, UNESCO designation really highly influences what the general public typically recognizes as historically important. They really influence a lot of the way that we perceive of cultural resources, what is a cultural resource, what's important to our culture and to our history, and things of that nature. So as we kind of like shift into this digital realm, and that's where a lot of human culture and interaction is happening, and where a lot of human art is being created, it's really important to consider that maybe we also need some type of commemorative policy for digital space as well. So that's a good transition to explain why I'm talking about the digital built environment of a critically acclaimed game at an Archeo Gaming Con in the first place. First and foremost, I am an archaeologist, which in the United States is accomplished by studying anthropology first and foremost, and then specializing in archaeological theory and methods. Because anthropology is the broad study of humans, anything that humans do, interact with, or find meaning in is of special interest to us. about halfway through my master's in archaeology, I realized how frequently we work with preservationists and like architectural historians, since both subfield are, at least again in the United States, are umbrellaed under cultural resource management, and decided that I wanted a second master's in preservation as well. Since then, it's kind of been increasingly difficult to not just view the built environment in both the physical realm and a digital realm, and modified landscapes as simply an anthropology of architecture and design. Now, just to address one thing briefly, I know that my colleagues in the Archaeogaming Collective have articulated this more in depth and much better than I'm about to, but archaeogaming is a lot of things. Not only are the physical manifestations of the gaming industry considered to be material culture, one really cool example of this is the Atari graveyard. I think maybe it's the Atari burial ground. If you haven't heard of this, if you haven't watched anything about it, I highly recommend looking into it because I think that it's really cool and very interesting, and it does show you a lot of like the methodology that archaeologists use, and it's one of the biggest instances of archaeology and game culture that I can think of. Also, I'll say that about a decade ago, I was at the Science Museum in London while I was stranded there because I missed a flight. And I saw a Super Nintendo in a glass display case with some interpretive information. And that was really interesting to me at the time because, again, it was a decade ago and I was already seeing my childhood represented in museum displays, which was pretty, it freaked me out a little bit. But also, the vintage video game industry is huge at this point. The Smithsonian also has some items related to the video game industry and has a portion of their website dedicated to the industry as well. Also, the Library of Congress, which is the United States kind of repository for archives and materials, photographs, really important pieces of composition of music, maps, things of that nature. They also have some video game archives. Now, applicants only need to send in recordings of gameplay and not the playable game, so there are some substantial gaps in the collection. Archaeogaming is also about the representation of archaeology and cultural resources within video games, and popular media and their representations of archaeology might lead people to think that archaeologists are only after the good stuff. Similarly, preservationists can sometimes be thought about as people who only want to protect high-style resources, the biggest and most beautiful. But the reality is that vernacular architecture or common architecture, and vernacular is just a term that explains what common people are able to do, what your everyday person is able to create and build. And that kind of vernacular architecture holds just as much information potential and is worthy of being protected. To explain it in a video game sense, if you are playing something like Final Fantasy VII Remake, the cinder blocks and the tarps and the corrugated metal in the Midgar slums technically hold just as much information potential and just as much scientific data as, Shinra Mansion or something like that. And that's kind of how you can think about vernacular architecture versus high-style architecture. Both are worthy of protection and preservation. So we analyze the relationships among pieces of material culture to identify patterns in human production, consumption, landscape manipulation, trade, natural resource extraction, and in dozens of other things. We're not just looking for stuff to protect because it's old. The basis of preservation and of archaeology is because there are patterns and relationships that you can identify in past material culture, and that's what makes it worthy of preservation. It also has a lot of cultural significance. There are a lot of places that are sacred to other cultures, and that makes them worthy of preservation. There's just so many reasons why a place and a space can be worthy of preservation and why it also has scientific potential. So, ultimately, it's about the behaviors and the meanings behind physical manifestations of culture. And meaning and information potential can be found in everything from the types of artifacts that people tend to think of belonging in a museum, to fragmented pieces of building materials, to grand forms of high-style architecture. The characteristics of architecture can tell you so much about what a certain culture finds important. It's difficult for me to not look at buildings as just artifacts that you can walk into and live in and visit, because they carry so much information about what's going on in society at the time and how society wants to present itself to the world. Building and landscapes not also give you a glimpse into the social and historic context in which they were constructed, but being able to read the characteristics of a building can also tell you how a place functions. Its social hierarchies, how transportation expanded in an area, how people move around the landscape. And that can get into a whole separate discussion about the relationship between human agency and structure. And naturally, this does also happen in digital environments. But I'm not going to talk about that today because it's boring and long-winded. And most importantly, relationships among people who occupy those spaces. We can tell a lot about that by the way that landscapes are designed and the architecture within them is built. We don't really question the importance of the preservation of the built environment in the physical realm, but we have been for a while now, existing in this time where human interaction is happening increasingly in digital spaces. And the architecture and landscape design behind digital landscapes are just as significant, considering they take a lot of the same concepts and challenges into account. Architecture influences the way people move, and many games now involve designers that have those architectural backgrounds. In the case of Final Fantasy XIV, on top of the in-game architecture signaling to people how to move around a landscape and creating these immersive and beautiful experiences for its players, the designers have also either employed architects directly or extensively studied architecture in a way that allows the built environment in the game to signal also what's going on in the story, which is really awesome. I think we've all played games where the architecture was adapted for a fictional experience, and the architecture doesn't necessarily mimic real-life natural resources that would be available in the environment in which those buildings and that architecture was set. And the combination of building materials might not be something that would work in real life together, or that you might actually see in real life, or proportions also might be exaggerated or embellished in kind of like different relationships between elements of a building that are kind of, blown out of proportion or enlarged and exaggerated to have an impact in the digital landscape. Now, I'm not saying that that's wrong either. That's just one element of design. I'm just saying that the inclusion of classical elements, materials, and their reflections in the natural landscapes and the surrounding world of Eorzea and the relationships within the world are really unique to the accuracy of the built environment within Final Fantasy XIV. So in just a moment, I'm going to show some of the in-game footage of some of the places that I find particularly special, alongside some photos of places where I think that the designers may have drawn some inspiration. And while I could totally be off base there, I might be making this up, and it might not be even remotely true. A lot of the spaces in the game do remind me of some really special places that I've had the fortune of seeing in real life, and many of these places that I think that they have potentially drawn influence from are highly regarded as culturally significant. Architecture, landscapes, and archaeological spaces in the real world are often nominated to something I mentioned earlier, and that's the National Register of Historic Places. Keep in mind that my training in the United States has only equipped me with the language and the context for how we practice cultural resource management here. I don't want to center the United States as being the sole experts on preservation. So keep in mind that other countries have their own sets of cultural resource law that might include other types of language and terminologies that don't necessarily match what I'm saying, but those are just as valid. In the National Register, for instance, there are 4 criteria for evaluation, and that's A, B, C, and D. A quick way to kind of break that down is that criterion A is for archaeological sites and spaces that represent broad patterns in American history or building trends, social movements, things of that nature. Something like the Pettus Bridge in Alabama was probably listed to the National Register under criterion A for its association with the Civil Rights Movement. Criterion B is set aside for buildings that are associated with very important people. I think the Martin Luther King Jr. House in Atlanta is one like that. Criterion C is for architectural significance, or the work of a master. Something like this might be, the United States Capitol, or the Lincoln Memorial, and something like that has been just immaculately designed, and has a recognizable architect or architectural style behind the design. And then Criterion D, my favorite, is the information potential. This is largely conflated with being solely for archaeology, but that's not necessarily the case, because like I said, anything can have information potential, whether it's a monument or a building. They can have scientific and data potential as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be an archaeological site, but it's typically how archaeological sites are nominated. In the National Register, there are also areas of significance that explain in what area a resource is important. These include things like industry, engineering, education, agriculture. So considering that, a digital landscape might be significant in the area of something like recreation or engineering as well. Lastly, there are aspects of integrity that must be maintained, that allow people to weigh whether or not the cultural resource being nominated retains enough of its integrity to be listed. There's 7 of them. There is location, setting, design, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. And integrity is the ability of a property to convey its historic associations or attributes. Has it been modified beyond recognition, or does it portray the same context under which it was constructed? These aspects of integrity can absolutely be projected onto digital cultural landscapes and digital cultural resources as well. While many games that are currently preserved are done so in a way that focuses on either remastering or preserving data and playability, the increase in popularity of MMOs might call for a different approach to preservation, because the feelings and the associations are different. Think about the fact that one of my favorite games of all time is Yoshi's Island. And, if you have something like that you enjoy playing, and you don't necessarily want to put the wear and tear on your vintage cartridges or on your vintage systems, you can go plug in your SNES Classic and play a digitized format of that game. Everything is basically the same, although it might be a little bit faster, which is fortunate. But you don't really have to plan for the preservation of an area where a large number of people can actually interact and occupy the same space. Last I checked, the overall number of subscribers to Final Fantasy XIV was hovering around 40 million, which is about the population of Canada, for context. And the daily number of players was hovering around 3 million. Now, I can tell you from my experience that if there were a place in the physical world that was designed for people to inhabit, and any location that attracted 3 million people on a daily basis would be considered worthy of preservation, because the obvious aspects of cultural significance would be pretty apparent to people. Now, if the world is only preserved in design, materials, setting, and workmanship, which again are important aspects of integrity when we're preserving cultural resources, many aspects of Final Fantasy XIV or other MMOs might be lost to millions of people who find meaning within the environment. This happened a couple years ago. I found out recently when I was telling one of my friends from my free company. If you're not familiar with that term, a free company in Final Fantasy XIV is very similar to a guild in World of Warcraft or in EverQuest. It's a group of players that belong to the same group, where they can interact daily. They can help each other on raids and dungeons and things of that nature. So a buddy of mine from my FC shared with me what happened to City of Heroes a couple years ago, and how that data was moved to private servers, thus restricting access to other people who found the space meaningful. And there's no value judgment there, right? I wasn't part of this. I am not privy to any inside information about what happened with that, so I can't judge one side or the other, because I understand that it's a very complicated situation. just stating the reality that this is something that happened. It's a scenario where the preservation of the game, it wasn't just enough to preserve the game. You have to be able to have those other associations and interactions and the feelings in order to be able to preserve something in its entire integrity. All this to say, developing a program for digital preservation like we have for the built environment might be one way to work alongside corporations and developers to get past those copyright hurdles and work towards preservation in tandem. Something that followed a similar model as the National Register of Historic Places, but was tailored specifically to the digital environment and the video game industry, could have similar properties as the National Register. One of the really important aspects of the National Register is that property owners have to consent to nomination, and being listed doesn't take away any of their control over their own property, and they can actively choose to be removed at any time too. And like any cultural resource, planning ahead of time for preservation, well before the resource is threatened, is best practice. And it's something that I think needs to be planned for, because there are millions of places in the physical world that allow people to experience architectural beauty and engineering. Not everybody necessarily has the financial or the physical means to experience that, which is, really important. Not everybody in the world is going to be able to go to the physical spaces that we find worthy of preservation. Not everybody can go to the U.S. Capitol. Not everybody can go to the Louvre. Not everybody can go to the Smithsonian, or to see these really beautiful places and to feel the awe that comes with that experience. A lot of people do find this experience in the digital world, and we have to start thinking about digital preservation as a way that makes that experience accessible to a larger number of people. With that, I would like to just go ahead and share some of the spaces within Final Fantasy XIV that I have found most breathtaking from an architectural perspective, and I'll include some terminology and some design elements that I think reflect important plot points and context. And so here they are. So I'm going to start in one of my favorite zones that reminds me of a building that I've had the fortune of visiting in real life. It's called the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. Going forward, I'm just going to refer to it as Papha, because repeating Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts over and over again is going to get real tedious real fast. So just kind of approaching the building. This is what's known in the real world as high Victorian Gothic style, and there are some things on the exterior that give you clues to the fact that it's high Victorian Gothic right off the bat. A, these crosses are here. B, this trefoil arch, which literally just means a three-cusped arch here. That's a Gothic characteristic, and it's highly repeated on the interior of this building too, which is really cool. We're going to take the long way through while I describe High Victorian Gothic. It dates to about the mid-19th century and was popular in the United States, but derived from English sources, specifically church architecture in Great Britain. One of the distinctive characteristics of the style is the rich use of color in both exterior brickwork and interior materials and finishes. Late Victorians really emphasized and loved deep, rich displays of color that were boldly contrasted against each other. In architecture, this is referred to as polychromy, and there are tons of examples if you do a Google image search if anybody's interested of High Victorian Gothic. Memorial Hall at Harvard is one of those. It's really lovely, but you can really see that polychromy throughout Yulemoor and the repetition of this trefoil arch, which is really cool. Also, these deep golds, these metal lanterns with their globe lights on them are really lovely, as well as these kind of fluted art columns against the wall. So we will go up to the top and check this out. So during this period of architecture also, there was one architect who really took the massing, and in architectural terms, massing is the overall shape and form of a building. So the specific architect really took the massing, the color profiles, and the ornamentation of High Victorian Gothic to unprecedented levels. His name was Frank Furness, and after he returned home from fighting for the Union in the Civil War, he started studying architecture under another American architect, Richard Morris Hunt. His first major work was Papha, and that was finished around 1876. And Furness had a little bit of flair for the dramatic. Sometimes he put support elements where there was no need for structural support. One of those places was in the middle of doorways, and I, didn't point it out in the beginning. But if you look as you enter the building in Yulmore, you walk in like the bottom right quadrant of the overall door, which is just kind of bizarre and seems very, very Furnessian to me. But maybe I'm wrong. It's a possibility that maybe this design does not pay homage to High Victorian Gothic or to Frank Furness at all. But in my head, I'm rolling with it because I absolutely adore it. You can kind of see too that these really beautiful lanterns here as well. I don't know what material this would be made out of in Eorzea. In the real world, it would likely be cast iron with these beautiful little globes lighting up everything. And a lot of the ornamentation in the building here are these very foliate or floral motifs, specifically on the arches right here, which is really, really, really lovely. And you can see just these deep reds, these really brilliant blues, the use of gold, and, oh, sorry, I was like blocking the screen with my map this entire time. Also, you get to see these structural elements that aren't necessarily needed for support. Like this right here is a good example. This right here is just ornament. In a real building, this would really offer no structural purpose. And again, you see that Gothic arch kind of repeated here as well, and all this tracery in the background that's really beautiful. And these dual columns here are pretty cool. And one thing that I need to point out too before I show any pictures of Papha is the fact that one of the things I noticed, one of the little details I thought was so cool, is that this segmental arch right here, and a segmental arch just means an arch whose curvature is less than 180 degrees. They don't rest on top of the capital of these columns, as you would assume one would if it was a structural element. So this is kind of like purely decorative, the way that this capital comes up over the arch, because that's not really supporting anything at all. But yeah, keep these colors in mind, and the fact that the capitals come up over the archway up here too. Typically in a building, you would see the capital kind of terminate right here instead. You can see too, I have my little Archeo cat with his tiny shovel. He's from Monster Hunter, but the fact that he has a shovel, and I've made my characters glam to look just like my field clothes in real life. It's just one of the many fun things you can do in this game. And with that, let me show you some pictures of Papha and why I think it influenced the design of Yulmore. So this is the front exterior facade of Papha in downtown Philadelphia. You can see that the massing of the entryway when you're looking head-on at the building is just very grandiose. It definitely marks to the user that this is the front entrance. This is where you need to direct your attention. But as grand as that massing is, the doorway, which again repeats this trefoil arch right down here in the very bottom, where you actually walk into the building, is kind of diminutive and small. And so this is something that really kind of struck me when I was playing Shadowbringers and I walked into the front door. I said, this reminds me of the front door at Papha. It's shaped the same and it's kind of stuck right down here. You see this big entryway with this itty bitty little door to walk into. On the sides of the building, if you can look at these windows on either side of the entryway, the panel in the top of the arch on these windows is called a tympanum, and they're carved with this very foliar or floral design that you see highly repeated in High Victorian architecture. And again, that's something that you see in Yulmore as well. Moving on to the interior of the building, you can just see these very bold contrasting colors of red and gold. And one of the really cool things is that this wall that has the gold floral pattern on it that's all carved out of plaster. And the tracery on the stair railing is very floral as well, and it almost looks like a pattern that you could see in Yulmore too. Unfortunately, what you can't see, I wanted to make sure that I used photos that were available from the Library of Congress, and unfortunately, none of the photos could, you can see the ceiling above where this photo is taken. If you could see above it, you would see that the paint scheme above this is this really deep blue with gold stars painted on it. And so it's these clashing reds and blues and these deep, rich colors that really remind me of some of the elements that you see within the game. And these lanterns also that Frank Furness designed that come up into these adorable little globes are really cool. And I think, I saw a hint of that as well. And again, I'm willing to be wrong, but I definitely see it. Here's just another little interior shot that shows how beautiful this interior is. And now my favorite part of the interior, and something that I think is really unique, is here on these interior columns. You can see that these columns are grouped together in pairs of two. And the capital comes up and reaches above that iron or steel girder, which doesn't usually happen. Like I mentioned when we were just looking at the in-game footage, these typically, come to an end right below where the structural element is going to sit, because that's the weight-bearing piece. These parts are really cool because they reach up over that, and it almost looks like they would be able to slide back and forth like it's a part of a machine, but it's not. And then this last image is just another perspective of the interior, and it's just showing again how beautiful the interior of this building is. I think it would be really cool if you are a cosplayer to go to Papha and cosplay there and say that it's Yulmore. I would buy it. I would find that very believable. But if anybody chooses to do that, just make sure that you mind the policies of the museum and are respectful to the artwork and the interior design that went into it. So moving on to Kugani, which is one of my favorite zones in the entire game, not only for the aesthetic appeal, but also the music is just really beautiful. The most obvious architectural style within the city is very traditionally Japanese, characterized by the use of almost strictly wood building materials. In Japan, this was due to the abundance of timber. Also incorporates a lot of horizontal lines with posts and lintels supporting these gently curved roof lines. So when I say posts and lintels, what I mean is this right here. These are posts, and then the horizontal beam supported by post is referred to as a lintel. Sometimes they also have these brackets right here that support these roof lines with these very gently curved eaves that hang out over the walls of the building. This style dominates the city, reflecting its cultural heritage. Now, what's really unique about the design here is that within the story, it's made apparent that Kugani is the only port in Hingashi that's open to foreign vessels. And in the main scenario quest, you're directed to the Ijin district, where foreigners, or Ijin, are allowed to live. So, if we run over here, not into that post, but up these stairs, we start to see the presence of these very Western architectural styles. Here's the Garlean Consulate. And the Ijin district and the Garlean Consulate look to have been constructed around the same time, with later additions distinguishing the consulate building, but more on that in a moment. These buildings use masonry building materials, which was not present in Japanese architecture, or traditional Japanese architecture, which Kugani is based off of, signaling the fact that not only is this a port town that's open to imports, but also emphasizing that the foreign citizens residing here are likely from somewhere that resembles what we would consider the West. Now, back in the time where this architectural style would have been popular, most architects were studying at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and European architecture and American architecture has a lot of similarities because of that. There weren't really architecture schools at the time that these architectural styles were popular, so American architects would have to travel to Paris to study at the École des Beaux-Arts, which is the School of Fine Arts, and then they would bring that European influence back over to the United States. Anyway, these buildings are all masonry construction, which again is very Western. And if we focus up close on the bricks, you can even see where some of the mortar has eroded out of here, which is highly accurate, considering mortar needs to be softer than the masonry materials it's supporting, lest the masonry crack or erode, and that is called spalling. So I'll step back so we can get a better perspective. In all of these buildings, you can kind of see that the horizontality of the buildings are emphasized the most, and the roof lines are kind of vaguely Second Empire, and I'll explain that in a minute. They're sheathed in these polychrome slate, and they've nailed the color of the slate, which was only available in natural colors like bluish black, gray, or blue-gray. Sometimes you can see natural slate pattern to reflect the polychromy that was popular at the time as well. And even though these aren't necessarily polychrome, they're pretty much the same color, you can still kind of, zoom in or take a look at them and see the individual slate tiles, which is lovely. Also, let me mention that in architecture, there are architectural types and there are architectural styles. The type of a building denotes the footprint and the floor plan. That's how the rooms are arranged, what the floor plan looks like. This is likely a Georgian house. I know that because it is symmetrical on both sides. It's 2 stories, has a central hall with 2 rooms on either side, and if we run over here again to look at the side, you can also see that it's 2 rooms deep. If I had to assign a style to these buildings, I'd probably go for a mix of Second Empire and perhaps Beaux-Arts, though they lack the intensity of sculptural ornamentation of Beaux-Arts, but you still have these very heavy features, like this coining on the side of the building. That's what it's called when you see these kind of emphasized masonry pieces on the side of a building. And they also have these heavy cornice lines, which is typically seen in Beaux-Arts and other styles of the time. And the roof lines look kind of Second Empire. Second Empire takes its name from France's Second Empire under Napoleon III, where the style originated, spread to England, and then to the United States. The most distinctive feature of Second Empire is a dual-pitched hipped roof. And you can kind of see there's this dual pitch here, right? So this is pitch 1, this is pitch 2. And while it doesn't look like a true mansard roof, which is what that roof line is called, I'd say that it's mansard-ish. So we'll run over to the Garlean Consulate, and if this building were in front of me, which I guess technically it is, I would assume that it was constructed contemporaneously with the others, but then the accumulation of wealth, power, and political influence by the Garlean Empire made the occupants feel the need to tack on modern additions. It originally had the same Western characteristics as the other buildings in the Aegean district, and the horizontality of the building is emphasized by this heavy cornice and this belt course right here. But you can see the additions here. To me, they look vaguely Art Deco. And Art Deco is a style that became very popular in the 1920s. It's characterized by very smooth wall surfaces, which you can see here with geometric motifs, and the use of towers and other projections extending above the roof line are meant to emphasize the verticality of a building. Here, it's a really stark contrast to the original emphasis on the horizontality of the building, and Art Deco is meant to appear, very streamlined and sleek, reflecting a modern fascination with machinery, invention, and industry. It was very much associated with technological progress. And we all know what the Garlean Empire loves the most and how they want to present themselves. And I'll show you a couple of examples of Art Deco in real life. But just again, a little bit of an overview of the Aegean district. and how you can tell the distinct Western influences from the more traditional Japanese style of the rest of the city. So an example of Art Deco can be seen in this Chicago World's Fair flyer from 1933, distinctly referencing a century of progress. In fact, the full name was A Century of Progress International Exposition. The theme was obviously technological innovations, with the motto of the fair being science finds, industry applies, man adapts. You can also see a good example of the Art Deco style here, mixed with a little bit of Gothic as well. This is the American Radiator Building in New York by Raymond Hood. I thought this was a really good example because it also shows those dark colors that was represented in the Garlean Consulate. This building was completed in 1924. I couldn't find a good Library of Congress photo, and the reason I was searching for those particularly was just because they're a public resource. So this one is borrowed from the Village Preservation blog. Thanks so much, guys. It's lovely. All right. Last place that I'm going to talk about is our FC house. I asked my FC the other day what some of their favorite places and spaces were within the game, and one of them said the FC house. And I think that a substantial amount of work has gone into making this a very attractive, fun place for FC members to hang out. So featuring that is a fun thing for me to do. If I had to ascribe a particular architectural style to it, I wouldn't be able to, simply because it has so many different features from multiple architectural styles. But ultimately, I think it's really cool that in this game you can create a house that has the accurate massing and the size of characteristics that you would see in the real world. First instinct looking at it is that it looks very Italianate, which was a popular style from about 1850 to 1880. I'm saying that just because of the asymmetry is a feature of Italianate. And then these overhanging eaves that are attached to the building by these heavy brackets is another one, as well as this curved arch over the door. The second story overhang that kind of spans around the entire building is a little bit Queen Anne-ish. And then there are some other features around here that are the same. Oh, look at little Palico running on this ledge. Last time I tried to jump up on this ledge, I just launched myself over it. So let's look from here. There are these, I can't really get a good view of it. Oh, perfect. These gabled dormers too are a little bit Queen Anne. And actually those could be anywhere from Queen Anne to Craftsman. These windows down here don't really have, a real life parallel. If I'm wrong, I'd love to know. I've just never seen anything like it. Ultimately, though, the styling and the size of architectural elements are really beautiful, and I think that if we applied the criteria that we do for real-life resources of the built environment to this game, I think that architecturally speaking, ooh, look at this Tudor revival over here, this half timbering. That's cool. Yeah, so you can kind of see across here too that individual player houses as well as FC houses can just have a variety of different architectural styles included, allowing a lot of space for just in-game creativity and artistic expression. But yeah, the architecture in the game is very much, represented by the same criteria that we evaluate real-life buildings with. I really think that architecturally, this game is the work of a master. It has a very distinct architecture to the entire game that's highly stylized and beautiful, and also Final Fantasy XIV, as well as the majority of MMOs, do represent this broader trend in global culture towards this immersive experience of online gaming, which is really fun. So hopefully if you are a gamer, you learned a little bit of something of architecture, and if you are into architecture and you somehow found this video, hopefully you are inspired to play one of the greatest games ever. that is part of the greatest franchise ever. So, to conclude, I just want to reiterate that it's really been impossible to play this game and not consider it as an important cultural resource and a really important digital landscape. As with anything I do in archaeology and preservation, my main goal in my career is to always be able to create new stewards for preservation and for cultural resources, and to raise awareness about the importance of conservation. The more people who can recognize why material culture is culturally significant, the more people are invested in the outcomes of preservation. The more people who care, the greater chance we have for preservation and conservation. And naturally, when it comes to the preservation and conservation of just about anything, whether we're talking about wildlife resources, natural resources, the built environment, and in this case, the digital built environment, profitability and the economic realities of that are huge factors that can't be undermined. But the more planning that can happen on the front end of that, the higher the chances for all of these things to kind of work in harmony. I really think that seeing something like the National Register, but for the digital built environment, I think that it would be really awesome. There are always going to be kind of some complications that come with that. For something that happens on a global scale, it would have to be something that wasn't managed regionally. It would take a lot of cooperation and a lot of planning to go in ahead of time. And there also has to be the awareness that sometimes vernacular creations and independent creations are cultural resources that are just as important as these kind of things that are, globally significant and popular. Hopefully, if even one person has become more interested in reading architecture and starting to think about video games as cultural resources that need to be preserved in their digital format with the integrity that goes along with their current form, then I will consider this talk a win, and thank you so much for listening.